morning, everyone. Well, we're getting settled here, and because I know our time is going to go very quickly, I wanted to start by maybe helping us recognize who's in the room and who we are as we aim to get to know each other, build relationships, and learn to know about the best practices that those among us are engaging in to address the very real challenges that Don and Father Stowe just described for us and that this panel will engage in. And my name is Lisa Koop. I'm the Associate Director of Legal Services at the National Immigrant Justice Center. I work primarily out of our office in Goshen, Indiana, and it's so exciting to be here and see this great convening of people committed to addressing these issues. So let's start out by just recognizing how long all of us have been doing this work. So if you have been working on refugee immigrants' rights issues for a year or more, can you stand or raise your hand? Nobody's gonna stand. All right, if you've been doing it for more than 5 years, that's awesome. 10 years? 20 years? And I wasn't gonna go beyond 20, but anyone beyond 20 years? So there is a large wealth of experience in this room, and we should be taking advantage of that over the course of the next 2 days as we're trying to address these really challenging issues that are before us. And so I want to introduce to you our panel. To my left is James Buchanan, who is the Executive Director of the Brueggemann Center here at Xavier University. And James is an academic but also an advocate, and he has spent a lot of time exploring issues of ethics and connections between national movements and how they translate to what we do on a local level. And I'm going to ask all the panelists to supplement my biographies with a little more information about you when you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that you're seeing. But James brings some incredible thoughtfulness about how we can connect national and local movements. And Heather Drabek-Prendergast is an immigration attorney out of Cleveland. She practices across a broad spectrum of immigration issues, handles deportation defense and family-based immigration and refugee and asylum matters. And brings a great wealth of experience in all of those areas. And Heather also serves on the Board of Governors for the American Immigration Lawyers Association and has been the chair of the liaison committee with ICE, with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and so has had opportunity to seek to engage with ICE. And I hope she'll talk about how those engagements have shifted over the course of the last year and a half, 2 years. And talk to us about what those communications, whether those channels of communications remain open and whether there is value in continuing to explore those communications. Next to her is Jesus Ibanez. Jesus is a self-described, let me make sure I get it right, loudmouth Chicano, did I have it right? Bit of an agitator, law grad who is based in Louisville, works with Mi Gente, and is working very actively on abolish ICE campaigns. And so I think we'll have some really unique insights on taking new approaches to how we address ICE and asking some very real and hard questions about, as a movement, how we coordinate and how we do the work to protect the rights of immigrants and refugees. And then to his left is John Kohlinger, who's the executive director of Kentucky Refugee Ministries. And John has been doing the very important and difficult work of coordinating refugee resettlement, community support services, and experiencing the challenges of decreased resources and working to protect refugee and immigrant communities and engaging with the rest of the community to support those populations. So with no further ado, I'll maybe toss it to Jesus, and you can start by telling us a little bit about one new challenge. And we're going to be talking about a lot of challenges, and Don, in his opening remarks, hit on a lot of them that I think are on everybody's list. But we want to try to focus a little bit on the challenges in the Midwest, in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky. So Jesus, maybe you can start out and tell us a little bit about what are the new challenges that you're seeing from your vantage point.
Thank you. One of the challenges in Kentucky that I've been seeing ever since this administration came into power, or really since before it, was the lack of organization among Latinx. I refer to Latinos as Latinx as a gender-neutral term. The lack of organization and the lack of civil disobedience within the community. I think the lack of empowerment among the community. I know a lot of folks like to advocate for immigrants or Latinx individuals, but I really believe it's all about the empowerment. You know, we can teach a person, we can give a person a fish and they'll eat for a day, but teach them how to fish and eat for a lifetime, right? I think that's the same concept. How can we mobilize individuals who are afraid, afraid to even step out the door, afraid to go to school, afraid to go to work? I think that the biggest challenge, and especially with this Abolish ICE movement, is to tell individuals it's okay to be afraid. I mean, we're all afraid, but at the same time, we can't let that fear, overtake us. We can't let that fear defeat us, and we must take that fear and beat it, right? So that to me is perhaps the biggest challenge. And of course, with these mass raids going on in Kentucky, I mean, we've seen raids in workplaces. We've seen raids, people being picked up outside while dropping off their kids at the bus stop. How do we help those individuals become empowered so they can stand up for themselves, and fight this oppressive system? I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
Thanks, Jesus. Heather, I suspect that some of your remarks will be a little bit related to some of that and the shifts in ICE enforcement, but what are you seeing?
I mean, obviously, and I started on the ICE Liaison Committee for ALA 6 years ago. My first meeting with ICE was the day after President Obama was reelected. In that meeting with ICE, there was this unbelievable optimism of things that were going to be accomplished during the second term of President Obama's administration. It's been a very dark shift in the meetings since the Trump administration took over, and I'm actually no longer on the committee as of last month. It was a bit of a weight off my shoulders because every time I met with them, it got more difficult. But the policies have, as we all know, changed dramatically. The agency has become significantly less transparent. It wasn't always transparent before, but the information that they've been sharing with us didn't always seem accurate, didn't line up with what we were seeing in the field. And it's not clear whether that was a deliberate effort on the part of headquarters or simply a miscommunication. The optimist in me wants to think that they didn't know what was going on, but in reality, I just think that there's something a little more sinister there. But it's been a shift, and I would say the biggest difficulty in this field is really knowing that as bad news comes out every day, as the policies shift towards an increasingly negative direction on all fronts, really, because it's not just in the context of removal work, but also in legal immigration. Things have gotten more complicated. Sometimes I tell myself it's bad now, but it'll probably be worse tomorrow. So I'm gonna take this with a grain of salt and not get too down about it. But at the same time, we all have to remember that it's bad now and it may get worse tomorrow. One day it's gonna start to get better and it'll just keep getting better. So we have to wait until that light shines through for us.
All right, that was
sorry for that bleak start, guys.
That was a little bit bleak. We do, I think, keep saying, like, there's got to be a point where we hit bottom, right, and we start to climb back up. And I think maybe many of us feel like we're waiting for that point, but at the same time, amidst our work, where do we find hope? Where do we have those successes? And that's a question that I've asked the panel to think about that we'll address. But I think it will be really critical that we continue to find those points out of hope, those cracks of light. amidst the current situation. And John, I don't know, in your work in refugee resettlement, I'm not sure that you're going to be able to infuse us with a ton of hope at this point, but what are you seeing? And can you tell us a little bit about your organization as you begin?
Yes, we were, can you hear me okay? We were, Kentucky Refugee Ministries was founded in Louisville in 1990, and we have an office in, it's open office in Lexington, and we have a satellite office in Northern Kentucky. So we've been settled over 16,000 refugees in Kentucky during those 28 years with a large measure of community support. Some faith-based, but all manner of faiths. We do a lot of interfaith work with Muslim and Jewish communities, and we have a lot of volunteer and business support, and our employment outcomes have been quite tremendous in Kentucky. And we have currently 5 full-time immigration attorneys, so we are, in addition to helping refugees and other immigrants apply for green cards and family reunification and citizenship, we're also doing asylum representation, including representation of unaccompanied minors from Central America. So I'll talk, hopefully, in the next few minutes about the attempts to, kind of concrete attempts the administration is taking to I hate to use the word dismantle the U.S. refugee admissions program, but that's what's happening, and it's kind of an underreported story. But to your question about struggles, from my perspective, our program has been, maybe 3/4 federally funded, so it's enmeshed in the federal government and requires some measure of bipartisan support. So I keep my kind of my eye on mainstream attitudes regarding acceptance of refugees and immigrants. And having worked at KRM for 18 years, like many of you, I was just taken aback by the demonization of refugees and immigrants. And all this time I thought our work had tapped into some broadly accepted ideals about our country as being a beacon of hope for oppressed peoples, offering humanitarian protection, offering equal opportunity for people who want to come here and make a better lives of themselves, for themselves. And then this, I watched a lot of Trump campaign speeches during that time, kind of got a little obsessed with them. And, I just recently Googled, just to refresh my memory, deport 11 million undocumented immigrants, and I encourage you to do that and see how many times that was quoted during the campaign. This was telegraphed quite specifically, and we all know about Mexican rapists and Syrian refugees, the Trojan horse, and all these young male jihadis coming in through the refugee program, even though I know from our work at KRM, the 300 Syrian refugees we resettled were mostly women and children. And the credulity of the American people to, in building the wall, immigration was not a insignificant issue during the campaign. It was a rather prominent wedge issue, and it wasn't just unemployed factory workers in Michigan who voted for what we're seeing. It was affluent suburban soccer moms. It was a shockingly high percentage of the American people just seemingly forgot everything we had grown up with and been taught about America being a land of immigrants, and a lot of people are amazingly oblivious to the role immigrants play in our economy. And if you want to go to a hospital and see a doctor, as the Reverend Stowe mentioned, in Kentucky, our horse industry or the agricultural, our farms, our construction, all the work that's being done by immigrants and refugees, somehow people are a shocking percentage of our electorate is just blind to that. And so, we'll talk about, I support activist sort of wake-up calls, but kind of through the prism of refugee resettlement and how the program is structured. I feel we have to give some attention to how to kind of reaffirm traditional values that this country principles this country has held for many years and kind of make some mainstream appeal. And to me, it's kind of bringing character. This is and I don't know how to do this, and we can discuss it. We try to uplift a lot of refugee and immigrant stories, but to see immigrants demonized as rapists, or every asylum seeker is an MS-13 Salvadorian gang member, or every Muslim refugee is a prospective terrorist. It's Orwellian, and I feel the character of the clients we've served at Kentucky Refugee Ministries all these years, for 28 years, is laudable in comparison to the nastiness that's prevailing. So that's the messaging, and kind of winning back some mainstream support for what I feel is a mainstream American enterprise of immigrants making a new life for themselves. That is the struggle, broadly speaking.
Thank you, John. And you've hit on a whole spectrum of challenges, of interrelated challenges. And I wonder, James, if you can speak a little bit about the work of the Brueggemann Center, the really unique model that you've developed to connect national and local issues through academic work, through partnerships and collaborations, and kind of bringing an ethical lens to this area.
Thank you, Lisa. First of all, it's really nice to see so many familiar faces. It's particularly nice to see so many unfamiliar faces. And what I want to say to the unfamiliar faces is become familiar with each other, because the power that we have is in the networks that we build. And anybody that you don't know in this room today, walk out of this room knowing that person and knowing where those connections are, because it's in those connections that we can really do something. And based on that, I'll make the 2 points. The dual mission statement of the Brueggemann Center is connecting the global and the local. And we've done research and work in over 60 countries, different countries around the world. But even as we're doing that global work, we feel like we're doing local work, because we're working in local communities. The other mission statement of the Brueggemann Center is building a more collaborative community, one project at a time. And really, as we go about that work, what we try to do is to do it very strategically. I agree with all the national issues. I know the national issues. There's very little I can do about the national issues except to vote. And obviously, we've got a very important vote coming up in November. I can contact legislators and legislators and legislatures, but it does not do much good at this point, because the country is really being run by executive action, by actions that are being done unilaterally by the AG and the DOJ and DHS and other departments, which we have very little power to do anything about. What we can do is work locally. And the key to working locally for us is building infrastructure, socially based infrastructure. How do you do that? We do it by partnering. We've been in existence for 17 years, and one of the proudest things that I can say about the Brueggemann Center is that in 17 years, we have never done a project alone. We have partnered on everything we've ever done. We will partner on everything we ever do. And it's the power of partnership, it's the power of collaboration that allows us. We're a two-person shop with a big footprint, and that footprint comes purely through collaboration. We began this work in refugee work about 12 years ago. And the issue for us was that there was no long-term community-based infrastructure to support a population, which we have in Cincinnati, of somewhere between 25 and 35,000 on any kind of ongoing basis. Our resettlement agencies do what they can do, but their resources are limited. The influx is overwhelming. Therefore, what do we do? So the power of a university, one of the powers of the university, other than education and other things, is to convene. So we began to convene people. We began to bring people together, finding out anybody in the community who was touching any refugee or immigrant community in any way and getting them in a room together. And the miracle of that is when somebody who's working with the Burundis or working with the Congolese says, here's the problem I'm having with my community. And somebody they've never met before sitting across the table and says, that's what we do. Let's work together. So what we are trying to do and what we have done over the years is try to be connective tissue. We've tried to sort of work with all the agencies and to bring them together. About 5 years ago, the Junior League here in Cincinnati came to us and said they wanted to work on refugee issues. And I don't know whether they thought we were getting into a turf war or what, but I said, wonderful, we don't have turf. Let's work together. We've joined in a partnership. We've created the Refugee Empowerment Initiative. You'll hear more about the Refugee Connect, which has come about tomorrow. And please go to that session because it's very powerful, the work they're doing. We now have over 100 different agencies in our area convening. And we have them into working groups, working on things like language, healthcare, legal issues, adult education, housing, employment. That's the power of networking. That's the power of collaboration. So where I see the challenges and where I see the opportunities is really in building local infrastructures and doing those local infrastructures through collaboration of groups that are nonprofits, business, government, local government, and educational institutions. And through those collaboration, don't fool yourself if you think collaboration is easy. Collaboration is one of the most challenging things you'll ever try to confront. To get two nonprofits to work together is one of the most difficult things you'll ever do. To try to get a business and a nonprofit to work together is equally challenging. To bring government into that becomes even that much more challenging. But that's what I see the work is going forward.
Thank you. Jesus, I want to turn to you, actually, building on James' recognition that these collaborations are so critically important and also so challenging. As an organizer, what strategies work? What lessons can you share about bringing diverse groups together, groups that might have different missions or different political leanings? How do you bring people to the table and get them in conversation?
So, in Louisville last year, right around Trump's election, Mi Gente came out with our Sanctuary City campaign. We collaborated with different groups, one of them being Black Lives Matter Louisville, which, at its face, people wouldn't really think that BLM would be interested in immigration issues, but, we found an intersectionality there. BLM deals with a lot of, state-sponsored violence against Black individuals. And Mi Gente with Sanctuary campaign is trying to do away with, state-sanctioned oppression against undocumented individuals. We found the intersectionality where, it's not just, let me clarify, Mi Gente is a Latinx-led organization, so, BLM is cognizant that Black folks are also faced with immigration issues. We also teamed up with the Fairness Campaign, which is Kentucky's largest LGBTQ advocacy group, because also they recognize that folks in the LGBTQ spectrum are also immigrants and also affected by immigration policy. We also teamed up with LSEARCH, which is standing up for racial justice in Louisville. And we just, sat together and strategized, what this collaboration is going to look like. It was part of a coalition. I wouldn't say that we did butt heads, but in our Abolish ICE campaign, which just began 2 weeks ago, we are occupying space in front of the ICE headquarters in Louisville. We also teamed up with BLM and other organizations, and that proved to be a bit more contentious. As James was saying, getting different organizations to collaborate on a single issue can be very difficult. There will be conflicts of leadership. You know, different orgs are going to want to lead. They're accustomed to a leadership style. They're accustomed to running things their own way. So, I mean, the best bet is to, you know, lay all those plans, you know, all those expectations to have a meeting and to keep encouraging each other. You know, when we go to these meetings, we would like to talk about, you know, that everyone in this room is on our side. You know, that everybody in this room, you know, has the vision to empower individuals. You know, we have the vision to help out folks, and we shouldn't be, you know, fighting with each other. And just keep a constant reminder of what it is that you're doing, and why it is that you're doing it, and just trying to find an intersectional way to do it has been one of our greatest assets.
Heather, I want to pick up on another comment of James, that the focus, the impact that we can have is local, that in this current climate, what's happening at the national level is being driven by executive action, by the Attorney General, by things largely beyond our control. As a litigator, as someone who is involved in cases that might percolate up to the national level, do you see ways in which our local work can have an impact on a more national scale, whether that's through litigation, and maybe I'll toss it to John too, through the lifting up of stories of participants in our programs, of our friends and neighbors who are going through these experiences? Do those links exist in ways that you see, or are there ways for us to intervene in manners that will have national impact?
I think lifting up stories is pretty vital because not everybody knows an immigrant, or maybe people know immigrants but don't realize they're immigrants, right? I mean, how many stories have we all seen in the news media, you know, places in Trump country that voted overwhelmingly for Trump, and then the restaurant owner is arrested and detained by ICE for an old removal order, and all of the neighbors say, oh, but he's not one of those people that needs to be removed. We know him. He's a good guy. He contributes to, you know. So when it's someone that you know, even if you don't have an immigrant story yourself, even if you don't realize that you have a connection to the immigrant community until, you know, it's virtually too late, you know, raising up those stories about the individual immigrants, the contributions that they make to their communities, fostering an environment where individuals can feel comfortable enough to come out and tell their neighbors that they're one of those immigrants that Trump wants to remove, right? Because oftentimes that doesn't happen until they've already been detained by ICE, until they're already in the stream of removal. What we need to do is raise up the stories of those immigrants and remind our friends and neighbors who may not feel that they have a connection to this community, raise up those stories locally so that we can create the dialogue locally. Because I think that that was a really fantastic point that James made, that we don't have the same ability to make an impact nationally, but there's much more of an opportunity to do so locally. So again, in our communities, we need to be raising up those stories and really connecting immigrants to the individuals around them, because I think there is very broad support. Once people realize that their friends and neighbors actually do have a connection to this, actually are that other that's being demonized, they want to come to that person's aid. So I think it's just vital that we create a culture where immigrants and their loved ones can reach out to the community and allow themselves to be recognized without becoming targets, which is the flip side of it, right? Because it used to be that if, let's say, you needed a stay of removal from ICE, you could go to the media, and if you got local news coverage and you had some advocacy groups that came out in support and you had great letters from community leaders, that person was probably going to get a stay and be allowed to remain in the U.S. The Trump administration and ICE under it have really flipped that script on its head. And when someone comes out and they have media coverage and broad community support, it's almost as if ICE sucks all the attention out of that media coverage and removes that person in a quicker, more cruel and vicious way, and does so with all the media attention, which goes on to foster additional fear in the community, because they take that example that's being put out there of the good guy that has all this community support, and then they run with it to the extreme and they make that person leave. So, press and media coverage has been a double-edged sword, particularly of late, and I think it's something people have to be very cautious about drawing attention to themselves in that way. There have been many stories of immigration advocates who have been sought out by ICE after speaking out about what's happening on immigration. So going to the media is something to be very cautious about. But as long as you have that understanding and you're going forward with the right case, I'd be very careful if it was an individual who didn't have a legal means to remain in the U.S. If you're taking someone out of the shadows who has no way to become legal, I think it's a real issue. But again, raising those individual stories up and helping communities connect with their with the immigrants within them is very important to draw more support.
Well, and I think also considering in that toolbox of advocacy mechanisms that we do litigate, and I think it's so important, and I hope that the lawyers and the legal workers in this room are connecting with the community organizers and the caseworkers and the refugee resettlement workers, and I think a lot of you already have these connections. But one of the things that remains available to us is access to the courts, by and large, in some areas. And so, as we're seeing increased use of detainers, let's think about ways that we can challenge the constitutionality of detainers. At my organization, the National Immigrant Justice Center, we have a class action lawsuit called Jimenez Moreno that has really curtailed the use of detainers in Indiana and Illinois. And so how do we look at the stories, communicate what we're seeing on the ground? What's the sheriff's office doing? How are they using detainers? Who's, at what rates are they employing this tactic to detain our friends and neighbors and pass them over to ICE custody for something as simple as driving without a license? And how do we build a campaign around that, using litigation along with all of the other advocacy tools to address those sorts of issues? Another example is in Indiana, we have a client who was prosecuted for working with false documents, which many of us have seen, right? And we see law enforcement using that as a tactic to target immigrants for prosecution and then pass them into the immigration system. And in our case, we challenged that prosecution, and we went to the Seventh Circuit and said, we don't think that working without legal documents, that using a made-up Social Security number to work, we don't think that that's a crime involving moral turpitude. We don't think that that's a crime that should be an immigration death sentence, that should cause someone to be deported and permanently separated from their children. And the Seventh Circuit said, we think you might be right. And so we now have a decision that says, look, immigration judges, you can't just summarily order deported people who have worked with fake documents. And I think as this administration continues to use a broad spectrum of criminal prosecutions to move people into deportation proceedings, it will be important to keep those conversations going between legal services and people who are on the ground who are seeing these things as they unfold. But I want to go back to John with a sort of related question, which is, we're seeing these kind of blockbuster maneuvers by the administration, the travel bans, family separation, attorney general decisions, but then we're also seeing a lot of mundane bureaucratic measures that are crippling our organizations in sort of a death by 1,000 cuts approach. How is that happening in your organization, and how are you addressing it?
Well, nationally and most agencies, including KRM, about a third of the number of refugees are being admitted. Our caseload in fiscal year 2016, 85,000 refugees were admitted nationally. The first year of the Trump administration, that was reduced to 53,000. And this year, at the end of this fiscal year, September 30th, possibly there may be as many as 23,000 refugees admitted. So that's a drawdown of more than a third, almost a quarter of the refugees we saw years ago. And they're doing it, people think, well, it was just the executive orders and initially after the election, but those were blocked by federal courts and weren't really in effect. So they've gotten a little wiser in how to downsize the program. It starts with overseas refugee screening, Department of Health and Homeland Security, U.S. Citizenship Immigration Services. They're not screening refugees overseas. That's a very time-intensive process, takes a lot of staff. Currently, they have 170 officers, DHS, in the USCIS Refugee Affairs Division to do all the refugee screening abroad globally. 100 of them have been transferred to the Mexican border for domestic asylum screening. And of course, what you're seeing at the border, the administration's trying to even block asylum seekers for applying for asylum at the Mexican border. The remaining 70, a lot of them are being kept in Washington for more training on more extreme vetting. So there are very few people out in the field screening refugees, so our pipeline is depleted. As far as the travel bans, we received 299 Syrian refugees through April 2017. I think we're still waiting we're number 300. We have not gotten a Syrian case at our Louisville office in 14 months. So all Syrian refugees, all Somali refugees, Iraqi refugees, even when the travel ban was not in effect, they're being blocked through, they're held up in a special security screening process. So people don't know that, but it's a pretty dire drawdown in refugee admissions. And in keeping with that, this coming fiscal year, there are 9 national organizations that have contracts with the State Department to resettle refugees. We're affiliated with Church World Service. U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is the largest, and Church World Service has a large. We have a sister agency in Columbus and Indianapolis, and of course, USCCB has a big office here in Cincinnati. The administration's already said we are not going to award 9 cooperative agreements come October 1st. We don't know how many, but this is in line with reduced refugee admissions, the presidential determination. People are thinking it could be 25 or lower. So it is possible, it is conceivable that some of these organizations, including ours, Church World Service, and their 20 to 40 affiliate agencies, they could be out of the refugee business in 75 days under this administration. So that's the approach that's being taken. So it's so I can just briefly follow up. James and other people mentioned the infrastructure that's built up around refugee resettlement. We have 50 staff in Louisville, but we have literally hundreds of volunteers and people who donate furniture and household items, or want to volunteer to tutor children or give us money to pay a refugee's rent. I think in this time, they don't make a distinction between refugees and immigrants, and we have, of our 50 staff people, 13 who are fluent in Spanish. So we are trying to put our resources, our network at the disposal to help some undocumented immigrants, and fortunately it's a very preliminary stage where we haven't had contact except through our Immigration Legal Services office with those communities, but we're making steps. We are serving some Central American families. We are doing case management for some of our legal services clients, but I think that's where, with the drawdown of the refugee program, I think we all have to make these distinctions, put these distinctions aside between, legal and, undocumented immigrant, refugee, and, migrant. It's just the onslaught, the assaults on immigrants is wholesale across the board, and I think I know at CARE, and we're trying to serve every immigrant we can at this time given what's happening to the refugee program.
James, I wonder if you can say more about this, about how do we respond to the volume of need and potentially scale up in this time of shrinking resources, at least in terms of resources coming from the federal government?
I think the first thing I would say is, again, going back to being very strategic about what we do and how we do it. I'm constantly on task forces and commissions and stuff like this, and we're always asked the same question at the beginning: who are you and why are you here? And I always say exactly the same thing. I say I'm James Buchanan, Executive Director of the Brugman Center for Dialogue at Xavier University, and I'm here to see whether we can move a single bar, a single inch together. Can we move a single bar, a single inch together? The key is not taking on wholesale broad changes, but understanding the baby steps that it takes to make those changes. That's the strategy. How do you go about this in terms of strategy and tactics so that you do achieve those goals? One of our strategies has been that we have focused primarily on refugees. We've avoided the immigration issue. Why? Because we avoid the quagmire of politics that attaches itself to immigration issues, understanding that anything that we do for refugees is going to be available for the immigrants. Now, part of that becomes an educational process, educating the population that a refugee or an asylee is a wholly legal citizen of the United States. People don't understand that. If we work with that population, we can, in fact, work with the broader population. Strategically, again, and tactically, working through those baby steps, what we've managed to do, and this is just since January, these organizations have come into being in Cincinnati. The Refugee Connect became a 501c3 in January. The Immigrant and Refugee Law Center, the first nonprofit law center, came into existence as a 501c3 around February. Compass, which came out of the Mayor's Commission on Task Force on Immigration, and we have Steve Driehaus and Brian right here. We have Robin Lamont from Refugee Connect over here, came into existence, and that's dealing with immigration on another level. We've also, a new 501c3 is the Cincinnati Regional Coalition Against Hate. That has come into existence. Interfaith Cincy, which tries to bring collaboration among the faith communities here in town around community engagement, has resulted in and collaborated with Trialogue, Bridges of Faith Trialogue, to do an event 2 Sundays ago in this space, the Festival of Faiths. We had over 1,500 people from 12 world religions, more than 24 religious communities in this room under the umbrella of compassion through action. So it's not just getting together and celebrate, it's getting together and say, how can our faith communities become the active moral fabric of our community? How can we collaborate on issues that we have in common? Because what we do have in common is issues. What we do have in common is values. What we do have in common is Cincinnati. And if we can take the energy that existed in this room and make it active on refugee and immigrant issues and stuff, that really begins to not just create the infrastructure, but to energize it and to sustain it. and to make it part of liturgical cycles, to make it part of the lived values of these various communities that make up the community in which we live. We're far too fragmented. We exist and we work in these fragmented ways. And I go back to my original point. How do we really become more collaborative in what we're doing? And so the way we go about this is by saying, how do we compassion? Compassion's a great moral sentiment, but it's meaningless unless it's put into action. And therefore, how do we take the compassion that I'm hearing from the speakers in this, and we really move it into action within our communities? And again, I go back to the same thing: infrastructure and collaboration.
And when you and can I ask, as you're facilitating the formation of these various groups that are doing such important work, what's the nuts and bolts of doing that? Where do are you approaching different foundations, different funders? Is community support coming together to make this possible? Concretely, how does that work?
Concretely, it works by, first of all, who needs to be in the room?
Yeah.
Who do you get around a table? How do you do the intersectoral work, right? So who and how do you bring them in and get them to give up a bit of their territory to be part of a common good? That's the first challenge. The second challenge is to find real projects that you work on. You can sit in rooms. I'm an academic. I'm used to sitting in rooms for endless amounts of time doing the big think on things that move in less than glacial speeds, right? So, but we don't have time for those glacial speeds with the kind of issues which you're facing. So find a project you can work on. One of the things that we do through a website, which is called interfacecincy.org, and is that we throw it out there to our faith communities, and we say any faith community who will join with a faith community of a totally different tradition on any community engagement project will give you a grant. Any group of young people from any faith community who will work with a group of young people from another faith tradition on any community engagement project will give you a grant. Now, what we're funding there is collaboration. What we get out of it is community engagement and community action. So how do we, that's another way. In other words, if we have the funding to do it, stimulate that. Once you begin to form an organization, then you need real projects. Don't say, we're here to solve the refugee problem. Say we're going to go into schools and we're going to do this and that. Say we're going to litigate, we're going to do real litigation, the Immigrant and Refugee Law Center. Have very specific things and go to people for those specific projects to be funded. That's how you build up your funding base. Then build a track record. Now, one of the track records, and one of the things as I'm listening to everything that I've heard today, I don't know about you, but I came in here sort of fairly hopeful and happy. It's sort of gone down 2 or 3 notches.
We're gonna get to the hope line of questions.
And I'm wondering whether I'll even survive the panel, but we'll see. One of the things I think we need to do a better job of is telling the positive stories of our immigrant and refugee populations. They do amazing things in our community. How do we tell those stories? How do we get those stories out so that people don't buy into the rhetoric that we're getting, that these people are threatening our lives, that somehow Ann Coulter could come out and say, I'm not an immigrant, I'm a settler. And we go, oh, yeah, well, that makes it okay. Our immigrant populations and our refugee populations do amazingly wonderful things in our community. They make real contributions. Let's tell those stories. Let's find an effective way to tell those stories. And that then changes people's minds in a different way and in a counter way than we're getting from the federal government.
Thank you. Jesus, as we're talking, in large terms about movement building, I wonder who you think is missing from this conversation. Who have we not connected with? I think what's been really interesting in the national family separation debate and outrage is that there were people speaking on this issue who previously had been silent on immigration. You had faith communities that are largely conservative and maybe somewhat restrictionist on immigration suddenly saying, this isn't right, this is morally wrong, this needs to stop. So who haven't we reached? How do we reach them? And are there certain people that we're just never going to reach, and so we should focus our efforts among people where there is the possibility of relationship building?
Sure, I think the biggest player in this that we're missing is the government, specifically, individuals working for agencies. I think people really need to be on board of that and see what exactly is that they're doing or what their agency is doing. I personally will call for them to just quit their job. I mean, we've seen ICE agents denouncing the agency, but not en masse. We've seen individuals quit because of the lies ICE has been saying. We need more individuals like that to be stepping up. I know a lot of people say it's a job, but it's not just a job. If that job is oppressing people, it's a bad thing. Another key component of this is law enforcement. In Louisville, for our sanctuary city ordinance, sanctuary city light, actually it was called the separation of power ordinance. And the thing in Louisville was that Louisville Metro Police Department was collaborating with ICE on some raids on people's homes, and that was causing great panic in the community. So people were afraid to call the police if they're undocumented, if they've been a victim of a crime, or if they've seen a crime. And then we were able to talk to some people in law enforcement with the financial aspect of it. Law enforcement, a lot of them have been getting budget cuts, or they're short staffed. And then why are they spending their valuable resources, their valuable time, to aid ICE in the destruction of families? I think we need to see more law enforcement agencies step up and see what step up and say that enough is enough. That the law enforcement is going to be protecting all the individuals in their jurisdictions. And I think just to answer the last question you said, I think there are some people that we're just never going to reach. People who are on the certain extreme, more conservative, we're just never going to reach those individuals. I was fairly shocked when this whole situation, the borders separating families and having kids locked up in cages. Some people, were just happy that was going on, or were just, indifferent to the situation. Let's be cognizant that some people were just not going to see the humanity of individuals. So it will be wise for us to strengthen our ties we do have to people, and also build a foundation of new folks coming into this fight. I know, for instance, in Louisville, we had a lot of white liberals who I thought were going to be on board with the immigration issue, but of course they were playing a lot into respectability politics. This respectability politics of, certain people deserve to be deported, right? Or certain people deserve to be detained. Or the question of, why don't they just come here and do it the legal way, right? But I'm glad that the more people, as this administration has really shown this card and this iron fist cracking down on immigrant folk, that a lot of them have come on board, and they just need a little gentle, push to be a little bit more left-leaning, a little bit more radical.
Can I
Heather, go ahead.
respond to one small point? So, you mentioned, Jesus, about more people, the working with the government, which I think is a great point. And then that you suggested that people who work for ICE should quit their jobs if they, that would be one way that they could show their, agreement with the immigrant communities and their dissatisfaction with the policies of the government. I think that there are good people that work in all of the government agencies, including ICE. I know that there are people within ICE who are very unhappy with what's happening and are outraged at the policies that the administration's putting forth. I asked one of those good people last month when I had the opportunity to see him at AILA's annual conference how it is that he is able to continue working at headquarters with what's going on. And I've never seen Hamilton. I'm going next month. But he indicated I guess there's a scene that essentially if you're not in the room, if you're not sitting at the table, your voice isn't heard. That everyone in the government has their own reason for working in the government. And for him, that's his reason. His voice is being heard, whether his suggestions are being followed. One would think probably not, but at least he has a seat at the table. And, I've heard about ICE agents. There was one in Nevada who quit to become a priest a couple months ago. There are people who are having a real crisis of conscience, but if those good people leave ICE or any of the other government agencies, then those seats at the table are going to be filled with the voices that we don't want there. And, although they're not able to act on the policies that they would like to see enforced and are in fact being told to do the opposite, the fact that they're being quiet and not overtly coming out with their opinions doesn't mean that they're not with us. It just means that they recognize it's not a possibility to speak out publicly in that way. So, I'm hopeful that those good people will stick it out as long as they can and do their very best behind the scenes to quietly affect change, even if they're not able to do so in a public way.
James.
Just in response to your question, Heather's point, who's not here and a seat at the table, just a question to the audience. How many people here are immigrants who do not yet have citizenship? I see 4 hands, 5 hands. That's who's not here. That's who needs to be here. And the question is, how do we bring them into the conversation in a more substantive way and get them a real seat at this table as well as other tables?
I think that's a really important question, and I'd invite all of you to comment on this. How do you facilitate the involvement of people who are, in some cases in the midst of their immigration struggles and don't feel safe to come out and speak about this? And Heather, you talked about this a little bit. We've talked about lifting up stories. I feel like attention in my work is constantly, I know that people need to hear the stories of, the people that we work with, the clients that we serve. I also know that comes at a great cost to them to, forfeit some of their privacy or to feel like they are suddenly a vehicle in a campaign as opposed to an individual with a personal story and a right to privacy. So, and that's a little different from your question of how do we incorporate everybody into the movement, but I feel like they're sort of related. What are the things that we can do to make different types of involvement by non-citizens in the movement more available to them, more possible for them, so that people can feel more supported when they choose to step out and become involved in different ways? Any of you with thoughts on that? I think it's attention, and maybe that's just something that we can file away and keep thinking about, because I do think it is a really important question, particularly, for example, family separation right now. We have reporters calling us, we want to film a reunification of a parent and a child. And that's really powerful because we know the audio of the children crying was a big part of what kind of turned the tide. And then those photographs that came out, were really, really powerful. But, what right do we have to ask these families to allow the world in on those moments? And I just think that's an ongoing question. I want to
If I could.
Yeah.
Because we're, go ahead.
No, John, please.
I mean, I had a former Somali client of KRM who made a substantial financial donation to KRM, which I was reluctant to take, and he insisted and said, you know, you should really reach out to kind of former clients of KRM for fundraising, and I was, you know, had never really thought of that, and 'cause we're sort of oriented on helping people, but. When we resettled a lot of, you know, the Syrian refugees, we had a lot of interaction with some local mosques and discovered this whole community of Syrian American medical doctors who is well established in Louisville. And you know, we have many doctors and professionals who came through KRM. And then the second generation, the children who came here and went through our public school system and went to four-year colleges and are now, you'd never know they were, you know, they used to be refugees. I think when we rent apartments, we deal with a lot of immigrant property owners who are, you know, quite affluent. I feel we don't always call on those people to participate in advocacy, and they're American citizens, and they know immigrant struggles, and they went through them, and so sometimes we put the focus on refugees or who immediately arrived, or immigrants who are, you know, facing consequences. And I feel this is a country of immigrants. We can find many, you know, spokespersons to also speak to this, as well as newer arrivals.
All right. Did you
Well,
want to add?
just to go back to a previous comment, I think one of the ways that we can bring those populations to the table and make our culture and our communities more inclusive, again, is by the positive stories, the contributions that they're making them feel included, making the community feel that they're included. Then they're not the other. They're not the marginalized. They're just part of the community. So how do we tell those positive stories of these communities?
Yeah. Well, and so let's talk a little bit about what's working, and where are we finding success despite these really challenging times. I mean, I look at, you know, we have 2 Supreme Court cases, DeMaya, where the Supreme Court found that a crime being considered a crime of violence as an aggravated felony is void for vagueness. I mean, which is this really like kind of academic thing with massively direct implications for communities and for the ability of the government to deport people who have come into contact with the criminal justice system, which we know happens because of the color of someone's skin or their immigration status or their socioeconomic class. And so that to me was huge. And then we have Pereira v. Sessions that really looks at the government's ability to place people in deportation proceedings. So if this notice to appear, this charging document that puts you into proceedings isn't completely filled out, then there are opportunities to argue that maybe that's not valid. Maybe the way you were placed in deportation proceedings is illegitimate and you could terminate your proceedings. Or if you were previously found ineligible to apply for certain defenses against deportation, like cancellation of removal, there might be arguments that are opening up, you know, for people to be able to go back and recover the ability to potentially seek relief in that form. So where else, I mean, I'm talking about some litigation victories, where else are we finding success? What's working? Jesus, have we abolished ICE yet? I haven't, you know, checked Twitter since the panel started.
Absolutely not, but hopefully soon.
But how's it going?
Well, there are more Occupy ICE camps are sprouting out throughout the United States. So there is hope in the movement for mass civil disobedience in this country, because I think it's very much overdue for that. We talk about, you know, advocating, but what about putting our bodies on the line for these individuals, right? You know, these individuals, every single day, they put their bodies on the line when they step outside of the house. And thankfully, I've seen a lot of community support. There's in Louisville, the community is responding very strongly to this Occupy ICE, to this abolition of ICE movement, and not just that movement, but, you know, other organizations such as like ASITA, which provides an invaluable service to the immigrant community in Louisville. We've been seeing a lot of support there. People have been showing up in droves. whether it be volunteering, whether it be donating money, clothing. There's definitely a sense of urgency within the community, and the people are starting to mobilize. And I think that is a strong victory, that people are opening their eyes to helping somebody else, to opening their eyes to these injustices that they're not necessarily affected by them, but they are certainly willing to do something and step up to do something. And I think that the time is definitely ripe for us to put our bodies on the line to help and to protect our more vulnerable population.
Thanks. And John, you've talked a little bit about new partners that have maybe stepped in a little bit to fill the gaps, or what's working? Where are you finding successes and hope in your work?
I don't know if it's reached a tipping point, but employment is just at an all-time high in my 18 years here. I mean, we're working with over 200 employers in Louisville and employing 50 people plus a month, and so I'm just waiting, but yeah, when we go to Frankfurt for Advocacy Day and we try to get these employers to come speak on behalf of refugees and immigrants, there's a lot of foot dragging and hemming and hawing. So, hopefully this cognitive dissonance of, well, I support Trump, but on my factory floor I have, half the workers are, refugees and immigrants. That's got to give way at some point. I mean, you can't have an economy without immigrants, and I think that's going to become more apparent. And we have a lot of church support, and it's mainline kind of Protestant denominations, and it just shocks me that evangelical support for this administration, its immigration policy, 70 to 80%. Just the indecency, of their actions and the cruelty and callousness. I feel that's some of these people are going to defect from support, and I'm heartened by a lot of students. We have so many students, interning at KRM or service groups, and I feel there's some good education on global citizenship being done at in our elementary and secondary schools. We have a lot of student groups, so and also some politicians at the local level are recognizing refugees and immigrants as an important constituency that they have to respond to. And so those are maybe not imminent sort of changes, but that's kind of where I see some support going forward.
Heather? I think that the crisis that we're seeing both at the southern border and at the interior, the separation of families, it's really forced average Americans to take a position on immigration that they may not have had on the issue otherwise. I came to immigration in the recession. That's the job I found. I couldn't imagine being more rewarded by any career other than the path that I have in the law. But I always asked myself, if I wasn't an immigration lawyer, what would I think about the stuff I was seeing on TV? And I see so many people that I know are Trump supporters, or I think would take one position on the issue and they send me a private Facebook message, thank you for all the work that you're doing and how can I help? Or it's very heartening to me, and I think that that's really going to be what turns the tide here, because the crazier and the more unacceptable things become, the more average people who may not have a connection to immigrants or immigration are going to pick a side, and hopefully it's the right side, and hopefully it's the reasonable side. But as the momentum builds, we're going to have more and more voices in the crowd who are saying this is unacceptable. I mean, look at the Families Belong Together rallies that happened just a few weeks ago. The one in Cleveland was organized very quickly by a woman, just a mom from a suburb who had no ties to immigrants but said what was happening was unacceptable. And there wasn't a rally planned for Cleveland, and she hit the button that she was going to organize it. And then she was surrounded by a whole bunch of nonprofits who said, how can we help you organize this? And thousands of people showed up on a very hot Saturday morning. at the very last minute to demonstrate against what's happening. So again, I find that to be extremely heartening, the level of national engagement and outrage on this issue, and I hope that that pushes us towards a positive resolution.
James.
Just one cautionary note, which is to say that if immigration is going to be a prime issue in the November election, we need to be very cautious about this. The compassion of the moment for separation of families and what's going on is balanced by a fear that's running through this culture about open borders. And if you look at patterns that are going on globally, whether that's Germany, Poland, Hungary, Turkey, France, immigration is right, England, immigration is right at the heart of every political debate that's going on globally right now. And if you look at the way the tide is going, it is not going well. So just be cautious about that, and to turn it back again, just to be redundant, the more we can put positive stories out about our immigrant populations, the more we temper that fear. If we just do it on the compassion of separation of families, it's not going to be enough. Where do I see hope? Well, hope for me is all that list of organizations: Refugee Connect, Immigrant and Refugee Law Center, Compass, Interface Sensi, the Festival of Faith, all of these things that we're doing here, and it's the little movements, the little things. We've just gotten a grant with Children's Hospital to do a pilot project on medical navigators, pediatric medical navigators, to help refugee populations figure out how to navigate the complexity of our healthcare systems. We don't know how successful that's going to be, but I get hope from it. I think it's the little things that give me hope on a day-by-day basis, as opposed to looking at the big picture. The big picture, I think, is very distracting in some ways from the real work, and I think it often is very depressing. One suggestion I might have is that if we all wrote a letter to Putin and asked him to talk to Trump. Sorry, I just couldn't resist that.
You couldn't help it. Jesus, what advice do you give to newer advocates or even more seasoned advocates who are doing this work? How do we do it sustainably? This is a marathon, not a sprint, to use that cliche. How do you do the work sustainably?
I think what's very important is to realize to be cognizant of the concept of self-care. I think a lot of folks just want to keep doing it 24 hours a day, keep going 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And while that would be awesome, it's not realistic. For example, our Abolish ICE camp this past weekend, a lot of folks had to go home because they had been there for 20 hours in the extreme heat. The heat rose to maybe like 105, 106 degrees. People were almost fainting, became very violently ill. And while it's admirable that they're there for the good cause, we have to be really conscious about our own well-being, because if we don't take care of ourselves, how are we going to empower somebody else? How are we going to advocate for another individual if we can't take care of ourselves? And also one last thing that I think it's great that everybody's been saying, all the panelists have been saying, is that folks who are directly affected by this issue should have a seat at the table and should have a voice at the table. We shouldn't be making any moves without their input on this issue. Because like I said, they're the ones who are going to be facing the consequences of whatever we do. Thank you.
Great. John, what are your thoughts on doing the work sustainably?
Well, I mentioned the drawdown. We used to resettle in the Reagan years, and over 100,000 refugees, and we were sort of in the 60 to 80 range, and now sort of 20s. And I just want to cite something I read in the Wall Street Journal, not a left-wing source. In 2000, CBP apprehended 1.6 million Mexican undocumented Mexican migrants. Last year, 128,000. 1.6 to 128,000 last year. Last year, 176,000 immigrants were apprehended, mostly from Central America, and most with family members, whereas in previous years, there were mostly economic migrants, young people coming alone. So it's false, this notion of inundation and deluge, and the numbers don't, it's just a stoked up fear-mongering campaign. But the reason I mention those statistics is, unfortunately, what the number of immigrants we have to support and care for in this country is quite large, compared to Germany, who would take, over 500 asylum-seekers, mostly from Syria, in 1 year. So that goes back to the local work that can be done. I mean, when I started at Kentucky Refugee Ministries, we had fewer than 10 employees. Now we have 75 statewide. Our budget was like 500,000. Now it's over, close to 6 million. So, I'm proud of that professionalization, but it was primarily federally funded, and so I feel like we're going to have to go back to the grassroots. We're going to have to go back to our volunteers and our faith-based supporters and our other nonprofits, and we're going to have to do a lot of things without the resources that we had, and try to assist and walk alongside that shockingly, shamefully small number of immigrants who are able to make it to our communities here in Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. So I despair about that, but also it kind of, that grassroots kind of, let's shedding all that bureaucracy and restriction and kind of doing what we were energized and feel we need to do in principle, that I feel that's a good thing somehow.
All right. Heather, we have time for maybe one more answer on advice to new practitioners.
Do no harm. So how many, I don't know how many of you practice immigration law, but nothing gets me more irritated than when someone comes into my office having worked with another immigration attorney, paid them money to do something for them, and their case is in worse shape than it would have been if they didn't have anyone help them at all and they had saved that money. So as you are getting into the practice of immigration law, reach out to more seasoned immigration lawyers for help. If you are already in the practice of immigration law and you don't know something, ask, research, look into it. Now more than ever, I think that there's a real effort by the immigration lawyer community to support each other, to answer questions. There are all sorts of mentor programs to be partnered with attorneys who have more experience than you do. Because again, there are so many complexities in this field, and right now the administration is doing everything it can to make legal immigration more complicated and to create more loopholes to trip people up so that they're in trouble more easily. So knowing what you're doing and making sure that you're doing it the right way is key. And if you don't think that you can help someone, try to point them in the direction of someone who may be better able to do so.
All right. So thank you to James, Heather, Jesus, John. It's been, I think, exciting and interesting to hear your thoughts, and I look forward to hearing the rest of us who are here talk about these issues, and also consider how in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, we're uniquely positioned to respond to a lot of these challenges. And in some ways it's harder, right? Because we're not in blue states. Our states might sometimes lean a little bit purple, but we're doing this in a place where there are some unique challenges. And with that, I think, comes the opportunity to have impact in ways that doesn't happen in places where maybe doing this work is a little bit easier, and there are more allies, and there are better state laws and better local policies. And the more I learn about what the people present here are doing in preparing for this panel and in contemplating the panels to come. I think it's really exciting. I think it's incredible that people are in this moment stepping in and really beginning to confront the challenges that we face in the flyover states, and positioning ourselves to hopefully have a broader impact and improve things for all of our immigrant and refugee neighbors, colleagues, friends, and clients. So thank you all very much.